physiologically to that condition and remain whole as an organism, whole and resilient and adaptable. And so that is then reflected, as we're suggesting, in the power relationship of gene transcription frequencies. This is a way of interpreting the complex data that's now coming out of patterns of gene action in organisms. And saying, what's going on there? There's a language in the cells that is making sense of the context, the external situation, and the history of the organism, the information available to that for modifying its state in terms of genetic information. And that, therefore, what we're seeing is the result of a, and again I'm going to use the term, a conversation within the cells of the organism that gives rise to meaning. And it's like what you and I are doing right now. We're having a conversation. It's what we do mostly, don't we? I mean, in humans, human culture is largely about conversation. I mean, it doesn't have to be verbal, but you know, it can be non-verbal communication and conversation. But what I'm suggesting then is that organisms are doing something very similar to what we are doing in speech, conversation, and creative exploration of ways of making sense of the situation in which we find ourselves. So this is just a summary of some of these ideas. But the point I want to make is that there is ambiguity. There's ambiguity. There are different possible interpretations that are always held open in a conversation. You don't have a machine-like fixing of the meaning and say, that's it, and that's the only possible interpretation. That would not give rise to a creative dialogue and the discovery of meaning. So creativity, adaptability depend upon ambiguity. Now what on earth could that mean? Because the basic assumption is that all these interactions work in terms of local determinism. But what we're pointing to is something much deeper that involves uncertainty, ambiguity, openness, keeping the possibilities open, which is what developing organisms do. This is the property of embryological regulation. You take a bit of tissue from one part of an embryo, put it in a new context, and it will alter its behavior in accordance with that context if it is still labile, if it's still plastic. It will conform to its context. Now there's a point at which it becomes too determined. And so you have a passage from a condition of less determination to more determination. But we're suggesting that actually the physiological circuits always retain some degree of ambiguity in order to find a principle of least effort, maximum grace, for any particular situation that the organism finds itself in. Communication networks, this doesn't say anything new. I'm just repeating what I've said. And then the evolution of organisms, genomes, and languages is just to say this is the process that organisms have gone through during evolution. And the simplest organisms, the microbes, the bacteria, actually are using these communication networks. They've gone through the same sort of process. They've evolved a language, and they make meaning of their context. Now, as you know, microbes are fantastically adaptive and labile and resilient. And it's because their networks are so open. Horizontal gene transfer, it's like the web open source sharing of information on the web. The web, of course, has a fractal structure, and we are only just beginning to learn how to use open source systems to optimize adaptability of human populations in the face of whatever the circumstances are. And the circumstances are getting more and more dire. As we go through the process of peak oil, cheap fossil fuel disappears, we are really being challenged with adaptation to renewable energy, simplified lifestyles, local food and energy production, local currencies. Now you notice that there, and most of you are saying, what the hell is he talking about these things for? That's not science. But what I'm doing is totally blurring the distinction between nature and culture, because I don't believe there's a distinction. And I think the fact that we have separated nature from culture in modernity is one of the deepest underlying causes of the crises that we face at the moment, because of exploitation of natural resource and the point of view that nature is just there for our benefit, and that we are top dogs in human evolution through competition and domination. Well, got a bit of learning to go through. Every single species has had to learn how to go through that kind of process and to get into some sort of coherent state with the rest of the biosphere. Otherwise it goes extinct. So we're in the process of doing so. So you can see that telling a story in biology that relates nature to culture necessarily transcends the boundary of where we have put the nature-culture separation. And it says we need to learn from the natural world how to actually conduct our lives with simplicity, efficiency, and grace. Because this is the natural mode of living on the planet. Now, that means that I obviously am putting art and science together in a particular way. And one of the things we do at, I was going to say at Sussex, but I actually mean Schumacher. One of the things we do at Schumacher in the holistic science degree is to cultivate different ways of knowing. In modernity, we have cultivated primarily thinking and sensing. Use empirical evidence, you think about it. And then you construct models that attempt to predict the outcome of particular relationships between what you observe, the phenomenon. But there are other ways of knowing. There's intuition and there's feeling. And that's always acknowledged as part of the process of doing science. But it's regarded as, not something you cultivate, but something that happens spontaneously and independently. Now at Schumacher and I'm sure there are many other places that do this, we actually cultivate both the intuitive and the feeling modes of understanding. So you put sensing, feeling, thinking, and intuiting all together. You still distinguish between these, but you actually cultivate all of them as different ways of knowing. And this obviously goes some way towards abolishing this distinction between nature and culture, because intuitively we can feel what the proper relationship is with the natural world, and we can begin to cultivate ways of living in our culture that take us much closer.
Haven't you just combined two components there, the intuitive and the feeling in your last sentence? What I was going to ask was, can you explain what feeling of knowing is?
Feeling knowing.
Yes.
What about when you feel unwell? Your body is telling you something, but it's feeling. And it's saying something to you about your leg or your stomach or your head. Now, that I would regard as feeling knowing. Cultivating the ability to recognize what your body is actually telling you and taking action accordingly, I would say, is knowing through feeling. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah? And then intuitive. Did you want to go into intuitive?
No, it was just that I was about to ask about feeling knowing,
Yeah.
and then you used the word intuitively feel.
Yes, it's true.
Right.
But I mean, these all, you can separate them out, but they actually belong together in a holistic mode of understanding. So that, this is something we could explore in more detail. How do you cultivate feeling knowing? And I think in relation to health, it's quite a good example. Intuitive knowing is something I think everybody's familiar with. This is knowing the whole. It's knowing something about the whole, the emergent property, the collective. And it transcends the analysis of the parts. You actually experience the beauty of a landscape. You intuit. You know, farmers do this all the time with the friability of soil. They feel things and they intuit the health of the soil through this putting together of different components. So the cultivation of the intuition is a kind of holistic way of knowing, whereas analysis and rational work is something we have cultivated very highly in the West, and I think it's totally familiar to us, and it's regarded as the only reliable way of knowing. Now, this is the point at which I make the transition to a science of qualities. And I must watch the time. How am I doing for time, Tony?
I don't know, we'll have maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay, I'll be quick now. Because I want to talk about a science of qualities. And the question is, how on earth could you have a science of qualities? Because you can't measure qualities. But you can. You can actually measure qualities. And I'm going to mention now the work of Françoise Wemelsfelder, who works at the Scottish Agricultural College. She's a senior lecturer there. And she's been doing work on animal welfare and the capacity of people to read directly the experiential state of farm animals. And to demonstrate using GPA analysis, the General Procrustes analysis it's called, which he calls consensus methodology, that we are very good at this. Now, it's not surprising, because we spend a lot of our time evaluating the experience of other people. It's what I'm doing now. I'm trying to figure out, are you fed up and pissed off? Are you interested? Are you happy? What's your state? We do this all the time. And when you have a farm animal in front of you, you can do that intuitively. And then we would say, yeah, but that's just subjective. It's not subjective because there is intersubjective consensus. And you can show this with principal coordinate analysis on these General Procrustes charts. And I think the next... this is the principle of least effort, maximum grace. Here it is. Can you feel that? This is what happens to athletes, dancers. Least effort, maximum grace. It's what animals do all the time. And we can reach that state, obviously. We don't always get there, but here is a beautiful example of it. Now, science of qualities. I'm just going to go through to those. Here's the consensus profile. And this is just to show you that there is a way of evaluating reliably the experience of different pigs in different circumstances. This is all done very scientifically, and if you look up the name Wemelsfelder, W-E-M-E-L-S, F-E-L-D-R, Françoise Wemelsfelder, at sac.ac.uk, Scottish Agricultural College.ac.uk, you will find this work. She's been doing this for 10 years. The veterinarians are extremely interested in it. It's been funded by the Scottish Agricultural Office, and what she has shown is that you can have a science of qualities, evaluating the quality of experience of other beings. It's not a subjective projection. I know how you are feeling. But when I say I know, I think I know, but it's something that becomes reliable when many people observe the same phenomenon and agree on the condition. Now this is the principal coordinate analysis to show you the words that are used by an observer of pigs under similar circumstances interacting with an individual. And I can't go through all the details of this, but simply to show you that this is a very reliable and repeatable method of approach to the evaluation of qualities of experience of other beings. So this is the science of qualities.
But just because all human beings, observe the same anthropological mores, it doesn't make that right. You're not necessarily getting inside the mind of a pig. You're just saying that all human beings agree in a rather imperious sort of way. That's what it means.
Well, that is a perfectly reasonable interpretation, but it is certainly not the only interpretation
possible. It's the most parsimonious interpretation.
Well, according to your principles, that's fine. I mean, I don't want to argue about this. I simply want to present to you evidence that you can examine at your leisure and come to your own conclusion about it. Because this is the debate that Françoise has had with academics right from the beginning. And it is the idea that we project our state onto the pigs. But if you look at the basis of consensus in conventional quantitative science, then it works as follows. I have something here, and I think it weighs a certain number of grams. I give it to you, you say, oh no, I agree, I think it's, I think it's 180 grams. I said, no, it's 212.
Why don't we just weigh it, Brian?
And then, what?
Just weigh it.
Exactly, that's the point. You put it on scales, we have an agreed method of reaching consensus. That's what this is. It's an agreed method of reaching consensus. And therefore, the claim is, this is intersubjective consensus. It goes beyond individual bias to a collective, and that's the foundation of modern science, quantitative science. Now I'm not trying to tell you the truth. That's not my job. I'm just telling you a story. And the story can be either useful or not, depending upon, what you do with it. But I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm simply presenting you with a point of view. And it's entirely up to you whether you make use of this or not. So I'm not giving you very much evidence here because there isn't enough time, but nevertheless, I'm pointing in a certain direction, and it's entirely up to you what conclusions you draw from this. And I don't want to, I know what conclusions I have drawn from it. But I've got a few of these charts, and they essentially these are the principal coordinate analyses of a high-dimensional model of this consensus process. And you get it from different people. Animal protectionist uses many more words than the veterinarian. The veterinarian is very spare in the use of language and totally convinced. It becomes familiar with this process of evaluation. The animal protectionist using many more words and expressing a much richer, but actually the coordinates turn out to be the same. And the discrimination possible with a qualitative analysis is better than if you turn it into quantitative data. In other words, you fragment the organism into the number of times they move forward, backwards, grunt, whatever it may be. You fragment behavior into the component parts and use those to evaluate something about behavior. But this is much more reliable, much more discriminating. So I just offer this to you. Again, I insist this is not the truth. I'm not talking about the truth. I'm telling you stories. But a good story is useful, and you can use it in whatever way you want. So I think I've now reached the end of this. Yes? And I'll just go back to minimal effort, maximum grace, and say that the overall story that I've been telling you is one in which we put nature and culture together because of certain empirical observations that are carried out in relation to these communication networks and on language and the whole question of meaning. So I will leave it at that, and we can now have a discussion.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah.
I didn't wish to sound aggressive. I thought it was really interesting what you just said, very stimulating. And I'm interested in that, is it ZAP, ZIPS, whatever the person said, the law.
Yeah.
If you do that analysis on a rationally designed language that hasn't been, as it were, honed by thousands of years of evolution, Esperanto, does it obey the same rules?
Yes, all languages do, but natural languages are the best fit.
Yeah.
And that's because, you know, as somebody pointed out in the talk I gave in Cambridge yesterday, a lot of the words in the language don't have, don't intrinsically have meaning. They're linkers. But the meaning comes out of the relationships of the words. And so sometimes when we design languages, we actually try to be more efficient. And we lose the richness of the interaction pattern, in which case it ceases to be as coherent as a natural language.
To what extent do you think that our intuitions are axioms? They ultimately cannot be argued over. They're just something that you hold or you don't.
Oh, I think intuition can be cultivated, and it transcends any set of logical axiomatic structures. And I'm just wondering if underneath your question there is the idea that evolution has honed intuition according to certain survival principles. Is that what you were thinking of, or?
Perhaps, I don't know. It was more that you said we intuit our proper relationship with the natural world, or something to that effect. I just wonder how you engage with somebody whose intuitions are to drive a large car and shoot animals at the weekend or something, something which you might not necessarily agree with.
I guess that's a domain of conversation and dialogue, and it's always very interesting to find out what's the deeper significance of some of these actions. But I think the variability of intuition is such that I don't think it's subject to axiomatic reduction. I think it depends very much upon your experience, development, but nevertheless, there is consensus in terms of you set up particular situations, and then people's intuitions lead them to a similar. So there's both the generic aspect of intuition and the distinct idiosyncratic aspect of it. And these, no doubt, will be dependent upon cultural experience and personal experience. I'm not denying the idiosyncratic aspect of people's intuition. I am saying there's a component of intuition which actually tunes into something that is real in that which you are paying attention to. It's not a projection.
I just wanted to ask a question about the notion of quality that you talked about as opposed to quantity. And I'm trying to understand whether this is an epistemological distinction for you or an ontological one. Is a quality different from a quantity in that for a quantity you have an agreed method of how to measure it? As we were talking, I mean, we all agree on the method and we all are happy with that, just put it on a scale. And the quality is such thing that maybe we cannot measure or we just haven't found a method to measure. But if it is this distinction, then this is a purely epistemological distinction. I just wonder whether there's something else behind it.
I think it's initially epistemological, but I think it points to something deeper, which is ontological. And, David Chalmers, the hard problem in cognitive science and trying to figure out about qualities. And this puts it in a different ontological relationship. So I think that there are epistemological aspects to qualities, but they also lead us in the direction of ontological distinctions that are really quite deep. What's your own view of this?
I tend to conflate epistemology and ontology all the time, so I'm not convinced that that is such a distinction at all. I mean, or rather, the ontological and epistemological distinction is a kind of epistemological distinction itself. So I'm not aware of it, essentially. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't really matter which is one way or the other. It really can be as pragmatically to solve problems and understand systems. Right?
Sure. Okay.
There's a question here.
I have a question about how does, with regards to intuition that you spoke about, how would you see deception fit in that context, wherein you're trying to read somebody or read a group, and you find, there is deception being projected towards you, but your intuition is obviously reading that, whereas the reality is something else. Now, how, I don't know, is there a concept or some kind of a study that reflects something like this?
I don't know of any detailed studies of this. I think with the science of qualities, we actually reach the point where we can begin to be quite systematic about these questions. And then you'd have to set up an experimental design to explore that. Now, deception is a very interesting situation and is a kind of, there is a kind of acting going on here, a kind of simulation. And depending on how good the person is at playing a different role, the deception can be either very convincing or very unconvincing. And so there's a skill involved in deception, clearly. And it is this skill of adopting a point of view which is not the one that you actually adhere to, but you're projecting that in a particular way. And so I wouldn't say that intuition is a totally reliable way of seeing through a deception. But I think we all have the experience frequently that that is precisely what happens. You see through a deception. And what is it that you're seeing through? What is it you're seeing? You're seeing the quality of the other person, even though they are, in some sense, pretending to adopt a different quality.
Do you think that would, this would be the last one, do you think that would happen